of the few years that you have to study here in this great place. Usually when I'm introducing somebody, it's someone who has to rush off and catch a plane someplace because they've come in just for the day. But in this case, Dr. Eytan Sheshinski has been with us for 2 full weeks as a visiting professor, the first Jon M. Huntsman chaired visiting professor of economics and finance. And what a great first professorship this has been for us. He's held faculty positions at Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Berkeley, MIT, where he received his PhD, and also Brown University. We're very pleased that he's added the Huntsman School of Business to the distinguished list of visiting professorships. In 2009, Jon M. Huntsman announced that he would fund 2 presidential chairs. As you know, Stephen R. Covey became the first Jon M. Huntsman presidential chair in leadership just last year. And with the announcement of Dr. Sheshinski as the first of the visiting professors in economics and finance, we have once again raised this bar. He is the Sir Isaac Wolfson Professor of Public Finance at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's very well known in the business community in Israel, having served for 5 years as the chairman of Israel's largest conglomerate. He's also been recently very deeply involved in the pricing of Israeli reserves of oil and gas that have been found off the coast of Israel, very significant find, and he's provided some very, very important service in that regard. He has a long and consistent track record of publishing in recognized scholarly journals. He's consulted with many, many different governments and organizations around the world about restructuring, which is the topic of today's discussion, and also the privatization of Social Security systems, which was yesterday's topic. He's been to Malaysia and Bolivia and Romania and many, many other places. And in fact, he serves as the director on the workshop on privatization and regulatory reform at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. Well, with all these impressive credentials, I'm now going to turn the podium over to Dr. Sheshinski to say something great.
Thank you, Dean Anderson. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be the Jon M. Huntsman Presidential Lecturer this year, the first incumbent. First, I wish I could make introductions like that. If only my mother would be here, she would believe every word he said. And also, remember when Oscar Wilde heard a very good saying, he said, I wish I would have said it, and somebody said, you will, you will. But I also have to explain, it seemed that I couldn't hold a job anywhere. I was at Harvard and Stanford, so it looked as if I was thrown out everywhere. So I have to, just a word, I always wanted to keep part of the year. I never wanted to take a full tenure anywhere because I wanted to keep my base. I'm coming from Israel, and I wanted to be part of the time in Israel, and therefore I felt that's what I want to split my time, and that's what I've been doing in the last 13 years at other universities. But the reason is I really wanted to keep my home base where I feel my roots are. Anyway, the topic today is and I also, let me start with a personal note, because between 1990 and 1995, I was chair of a corporation, the largest in Israel at the time, trading now on NASDAQ, on the New York Stock Exchange, a medium small company that has annual profits of about $3 billion, a very diversified conglomerate at the time. And it had a very strange ownership, which probably most of you are not familiar with, because only in Israel and in Germany, to a less extent, the trade unions were the owners. Historical reasons: before the state of Israel was established in 1948, small cooperatives then later mushroomed and became large corporations, and the trade union owned a large segment of the economy in the early 50s. I call this situation a schizophrenic situation because trade unions, who are supposed to represent the workers' interests, were the owners also representing the interests of the firms, and had to look at the line of profitability and so forth. And of course, it came to an impasse. And then in the late 80s, after a hyperinflation period and so forth, that basically this whole sector, the 15% of the economy, went bankrupt. The largest bank, the largest corporation, which I was then chair of, and so forth. And I was called in to become chair of the board of directors of that corporation called Koor Industries, if you look up in the New York Stock Exchange. And being in de facto bankruptcy, I'm saying de facto, we don't have Chapter 13. So there were 5 difficult years. It was de facto in bankruptcy, creditor banks from some banks do not exist anymore today. For you will be just names, Bankers Trust and Moneyhoney and Barclays Bank in the UK, and so they were all creditor banks, and they were suing in courts. And I became chair. I guess they thought that if I'll fail, then it's easy to just blame the professor who came in, doesn't know much from what's going on. If I'll succeed, it will be easy to push him out eventually later on. So it was a good move from the trade union to push me in, to bring me in. On the other hand, I told him from the outset that if anybody steps on my toes, I'm just going back to academia, and this is my threat point. And they didn't. And within 5 years, we turned around that corporation. We floated the stock on the stock exchange and the market. And anyway, that's the time when I became interested in privatization in earnest. I taught it in public economics all along. This is, of course, part standard in a standard course on public, a graduate course on public economics. But then I became interested in privatization. It was a special case indeed, trade unions owning enterprise. It was a long arm of the government. It was semi-governmental enterprises. And then I became interested in privatization. And since then I have done privatization work, consulting work in various countries. Some of them have been mentioned here, others including Poland and Russia and other countries. And I was deeply into the issue of privatization of state-owned enterprise. So that's my personal note and my personal interest in that, if there will be questions at the end. Now also a question about timing. Dean Anderson tells me that some of the students here have to leave at 2:30. So I will try to aim the core of what I want to say today and finish by 2:20 or so, have 1 or 2 quick questions, and then stay on for those who will stay on to 3 o'clock for questions and answers. Okay, so let's relegate the questions and answers to that period after we have a break at about 2:25 or so for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll be here for those who want to stay here. It's not necessary to stay here as long. I will stay. You know, the lecturer who comes in and says, how long do I have to, can I speak? And the answer is, you can speak as long as you want. We'll leave at 4. Okay, that's the time schedule. Okay, so let's do some work. I count personally. I will deviate a little bit from. There are lots of slides, and when I looked at them, given now that we want to compress this time, I will skip many. I count November 1st, 1981, as the beginning of the privatization trend worldwide, because on that day, Margaret Thatcher has decided to, the Prime Minister at that time of the UK, the United Kingdom, privatize British Telecom. This was a privatization of worth about $4.8 billion, the largest that has been seen at that time. And then shortly afterwards, they privatized British Air and others, and British Gas, and British Cables, wireless and cable, and so forth. I count that this was a successful IPO of British Telecom on the market in London, New York, and Tokyo simultaneously. Successful. The world looked and said, it can be done successfully. And the privatization process worldwide has started in earnest at that time. Since then, privatization programs and plans have been implemented in almost all Western countries and developing countries alike, particularly Latin America, and needless to say, the ex-Soviet Union, where privatization is actually part of the whole of the move of the whole economy from a Sovietile, bureaucratic, administrative economy to a private property, market-oriented economy. So there, privatizing state-owned enterprise was part of privatizing the whole economy, including dwellings and lodgings and small businesses and so forth. I thought actually that this may be of some interest, the process that happened in Russia, because it had some defining features which were absent elsewhere, and we can learn from them. I don't know how many of you have followed the early 90s process of so-called the voucher privatization in Russia. Other Eastern European, they're called today transition economies at the time, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth, have all gone slightly different routes than the Soviet, than Russia. But Russia, by size and by importance, is clearly a process that is worth studying. And allow me, if there's interest, I would like to devote the last part of my lecture, maybe 10, 15 minutes, to the Russian process. I think it will be interesting because it has really unique features. You can imagine an economy which didn't have any financial markets before. And you're talking about privatizing. What would be on the demand side? Where's the money coming from? There were no financial institutions. So one of the crucial questions of sequencing privatization in an economy which doesn't have market institutions, financial institutions in particular, how do you start privatization? Is there something that perhaps banking, establishing of private banks is a sine qua non, is a necessary condition for the privatization of other enterprise and so forth. So I'll touch upon it later on at the end about Soviet privatization, but mostly I will be talking about the Western experience in privatization. You know that after Second World War, there was a wave of nationalization. Okay, in particular, of course, there was the natural monopolies, and I'll talk about them separately. The UK privatized basically all the basic industries. It was coal and steel and everything else, electricity, of course, and so forth. So did France. France, under a socialist government at that time, nationalized banks like Banque Paribas, other banks nationalized quite widely, and so did other countries. This was a wave of nationalizations, not only of natural monopolies, and I'll talk about what natural monopolies are, what they are, but also of insurance firms, banking, quite a wide array of industries that were held by the government. Now, on paper, government ownership could perhaps alleviate some of the problems of market failures, particularly when it comes to natural monopolies and to natural monopolies, to increasing returns to scale, what economists call. So what government can actually perhaps improve things, but this is on paper. In fact, this theory, it's called sometimes the social view, and I'll come back to it when I come back to the slides. The social view has really failed miserably. And privatization has started, which is interesting, without any empirical research that shows that these public-held, state-owned enterprise, SOEs, that's the why did they fail, and did they fail? There were no studies. When Thatcher did this in 1981, there were no previous studies, but now we have quite a bit. And what I want to show you today is indeed that the empirical evidence shows that all in all, privatization was rather successful in its goals, but we have to define what are the goals of privatization. Efficiency, profitability, allocation of resources, the budget, government's budget, and subsidies, and so forth and so on. Let me start to give you just two examples which are problematic. They were given by Andrei Schleifer some years ago on the issue of, he asked the question, should we privatize Air Force One? He said, look, it's costly, but and he wants to give that, he gave that as an example, which as a bad candidate for privatization. Why? He said, the contract that had to be signed was a private concession to a private firm that will run Air Force One is very problematic. The scheduling is erratic and can be from today to tomorrow. You cannot write contracts by hours or so forth. They're always sort of from today to tomorrow new information. So you cannot, emergencies, states that you can, occurrences that you cannot predict ahead of time. Of course, needless to say, the security issues, right? And all these together say, particularly the contractual part, because Air Force One is so difficult to predict what it's scheduling, writing a very detailed contract is very difficult. And so Schleifer tried to point out that bad candidates for privatization are those industries or sectors or firms which you cannot predict ahead of time pretty clearly what will be their production plan, their activities, and so forth. They should be left to the government. He brought other examples which raised other more moral, philosophical issues like private prisons, but I won't go into that today. In general, I will talk about privatization not in terms of outsourcing services, but mainly in outsourcing firms or production firms, because you can talk about privatization also outsourcing services. This university may outsource cleaning services to a private contractor, and that's done for efficiency purposes, for cost-saving purposes, and that there's no inherent problem in that, in outsourcing services, in most cases. Okay? So the question is, in order to know the goals of privatization, it's best perhaps to start by talking about the deficiencies of public ownership. I said on paper, so the socialist view at the time, I was young, you had read in books that this Abba Lerner, some very famous economists, thought that the ownership should not matter. In fact, the government, by owning these firms, can solve some of the monopoly problems. The government will really can take care of efficiency aspects and not necessarily profit maximizing whenever there's a conflict between profit maximizing and efficiency, like with natural monopolies, which we'll come to. And but as I said, in fact, these enterprises worldwide have failed miserably. They produced old-fashioned products. They never innovated. One idea was originally also perhaps the government can advance pushing new knowledge, new products. Nothing of the sort. The nationalized industries in the UK were the most old-fashioned industries, the steel, the coal. There was no innovation. There was no question of innovation. The location was sometimes dictated by political considerations, and political considerations is a major aspect, the politicization of firms. Schleifer and others have emphasized that, particularly, of course, in Russia, but in other countries as well. You look at the location where Airbus is located in France. It's located in Toulouse. You think, was that the best area in France to produce? No. Airbus was established under a socialist government. Mitterrand was the president at that time, and his constituency was located around that area, and with high unemployment. So Airbus is located in Toulouse, in the area of Toulouse. So location issues, and of course then also all kind of other direct and indirect subsidies, which are stemmed by political considerations, are prevalent in all these firms. Another question which will come up is, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead, is ownership really the issue? Couldn't the government, isn't the structure of the market more important than the ownership per se? What I mean is the following. Take a government-owned, take an example in France, Renault. I don't know how many of you know that Renault, the car producer, which is competing successfully in the world ever since the Second World War, it has been owned by the government. There was a legendary manager called Dreyfus, the great-grandson of Dreyfus, the famous Dreyfus, and it has been managed very successfully. And so the conclusion of many observers was, how come Renault, a government-owned car in a very competitive industry, is doing so successfully? The answer is, they say, it was in a competitive environment. the discipline of the market is more important than ownership. So establish competition, the ownership won't matter. Arrange competition. But this, again, is a naive and perhaps abstract thinking, because in most countries, the shielding off of state-owned enterprises is part of the strengths of these enterprises, the political strengths of these enterprises to influence the government not to open markets to competition. And if you look around, particularly in developing countries, but also in developed countries, you'll find that state-owned enterprises are shielded from import competition and from inside internal competition as well, simply legally. Again, personal memory, I was, as chair of this corporation, I went to Morocco at some point. And in Morocco, of course, you know, it's a kingdom, it's a king, it's a real king. In other words, the king is in business. So he owned, and there was the largest agri business in Morocco, which produced sugar. By the way, they use sugar there is sold in stores by cones of sugar. You cut it off. You buy cones of sugar. Anyway, I came there to make a contract, a dairy contract, and they showed me around, and I asked, how come sugar price is about 30% higher than the world price of sugar? And they said, well, the ownership is the king is the owner, and we don't allow imports of sugar. So just as an example. So, and worldwide, this is the experience. You cannot talk in abstraction of opening up competition when they go hand in hand. State-owned enterprises went hand in hand with protection and shielding off from competition. In principle, competition could solve perhaps some of the ownership problems, providing the market discipline. When it's there, it's never better than that. But in most cases, it's just not the way it goes. You have to look at the picture as a whole, including the political economy issues. Okay? Let's go a little bit more organized fashion. Let me... So the process of privatization has started in earnest at that time in the early 80s. France, under Chirac, the first government of Chirac, he privatized banks, which were nationalized earlier on. He privatized the banks. Again, as in the UK, when the Labour government in the UK, when the Labour Party said at the time, when cable and wireless was privatized, they said, when we come back, we'll nationalize it again. They never did. In France, too, the Socialist Party said, when we'll come back, we'll again renationalize Bank Paribas and the other banks. They never did. But so the privatization wave in France went on under the first Chirac government in the late 80s. Bank Paribas, the Suez, and others, many other industries. Now, you know, in this country, there's not much to talk about state-owned enterprise. In fact, there were two sort of government-owned enterprises, production. One is the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, and the other one was Amtrak. And two, by the way, the selling of that was quite political, of Amtrak, if you're too young to remember, but it was quite political. But this is not a serious problem in this country, but you should know in other countries, the state-owned enterprise sector comprises about 10 to 15% of the economy in the 80s, for example, in the early 80s, and since then it has shrunk. So just to give you a figure that we are going towards privatization, this is the decrease in the percentage of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, in various countries. So here it goes in low-income countries, 12% decrease in GDP in those years between 80 and 97. These are the years of privatization. And 6% minus 5.5. The direction is clearly going towards privatization in all these countries. And now, what were the explicit objectives? It's like more orderly fashion. To achieve a higher allocative and productive efficiency, needless to say, to strengthen the role of private sector in the economy, to improve the public sector's financial health, and finally, to free resources for allocation in other important areas of government activity, usually related to social policy. Just give you an example. For example, in Bolivia, 10 years ago, when they established privately mandated pension funds, the question is, what will be the initial assets of these private pension funds be? Because there were people who worked who were in the Social Security, the public Social Security system up to that time. The question is how to account for those years that they were in the public system. And so Losada, the president at that time of Bolivia, I was there when he did that, gave them the assets of the privatized state-owned enterprise to the pension funds. This is one typical tool for the elderly eventually, and that was, it was called capitalization of giving the shares of the state-owned enterprises to the pension funds. I told you about the political view, which emphasizes the intervention of political considerations in production activities, and the management view, which is the monitoring issue, which is called by economists sometimes the agency issue. The government or the ministries do not receive in real time information about the performance of these industries. The monitoring is clearly deficient, and there are many studies who show that, and I'll perhaps outline some of those. Another issue is the soft budget constraint. Soft budget constraint means that is basically you can always count, like the moral hazard, you can count on being bailed out. Even if you have losses, eventually the government will come to the rescue of state-owned enterprises. Now, just to give you a figure to understand this, we're not talking about small numbers. In India, the subsidies to state-owned enterprises is about 160% of the budget for education in India. The whole budget for education is smaller than the subsidies that go into the state. I'm talking about the World Bank study in the 90s. Things may have changed now in India, and I think they did change. But at that time, there were 160% of the educational budget. Enormous. And you should also have in mind, the state-owned enterprise workers were not the most needy ones. In fact, in some circles, the press would call them the fat cats. They were the highest paid in India, among the highest paid. So this was not a redistribution towards the poor. It was just political power. Now, it's worth quoting, starting with this, with Adam Smith, of course. In every great monarchy, 1776, in every great monarchy in Europe, the sale of the crown lands would produce a very large sum of money, which, if applied to the payments of the public debts, would deliver from mortgage a much greater revenue than any which those land would have ever afforded to the crown. When the crown lands had become private property, they would, in the course of a few years, become well improved and well cultivated. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the incentive issue. And by the way, again, a figure which I always have in my head is, in Russia, the collectivization of the farms, which went on under Stalin in the 30s, under tremendous human cost. Millions were killed and sent to Siberia and so forth, the kulaks and so forth. But they had, over the years, they had the collective lands in every kolkhoz. Kolkhoz was the collective farm. There were the collective lands, and then each farmer had a small lot near the house. 2% of the land was privately cultivated. The figures for the crop for those 2% was about, I think, 35% of the total crop. So in other words, the attention and the care that the farmers gave to their private plots compared to the total was disproportionate, and as expected, it's more or less in the direction that, of course, an extreme case that Adam Smith alluded to. Now, I already said, why does ownership matter? I asked this provocatively. Perhaps other aspects like competition are more important. And that has been analyzed by several issues. And under perfect competition, no informational problems, no informational asymmetries or anything like that. Indeed, in perfect competition, no informational problems, ownership should not matter. Perfect competition, the discipline of the market would arrange that prices will be at the lowest at the efficient level. But in case of any of these market failures, then public ownerships became justified as a solution to the first of these three conditions, market failure argument. That's the major argument. Now, a word about natural monopolies. I mentioned the word before, but perhaps just to, again, define what is natural. Natural monopoly is a situation in which technology makes one firm the most efficient supplier of the market. This is the case of decreasing costs. Typically, these are infrastructure industries. We are heavy setup costs, fixed costs, electricity, water, telecommunications, and so forth, typically. Some transportation, so forth. Setup costs are very large, and marginal costs are low. And you know that efficiency would dictate that prices should be equal to marginal costs, right? To be marginal cost. But if under decreasing cost, in that case, when you have large fixed costs, setup costs, then marginal cost pricing will entail losses. You cannot cover the fixed costs. So we are talking about deviations from marginal cost pricing. And in fact, in that case, the issue of regulations. See, with natural monopolies, those firms, when one firm can most efficiently supply the whole market, then you have a conflict in the following sense, that if there will be one firm, it will try to exploit its monopoly power versus the consumers. So when you talk about natural monopolies, we don't talk about a once and for all move to sell those industries to private interests. We are talking about substitution of public ownership of a natural monopoly, let's say water or electricity, and so forth, to private owners, supplemented by regulation. And regulation entails in itself various distortions. So from now, that's why this is a difficult subject. Infrastructure, to my mind, is the only really theoretically difficult and applied and factually difficult issue to tackle. And we all are aware of all these issues in telecommunications, electricity, and so on. I'll say something about electricity, say the example of California towards the end, okay? Natural monopolies are therefore situations in which the basic rule of thumb that I teach my students when I talk about privatization is in all industries which are competition is viable, sell. The government has no business being in business in those industries. Insurance, financial institutions, large financial institutions, the government has no business. Clearly it will do worse than private markets. And we'll see the data now. We'll see some facts about that. Natural monopolies is different. With natural monopolies, as I said, you weigh on the one hand the distortions of government ownership, the inefficiencies, those things that I pointed out. And there's a consensus on these inefficiencies. And on the other hand, privately owned monopolies, natural monopolies, regulated by government agencies. And the regulatory schemes are all entail in one way or another also distortions. And therefore, it's a question of the numbers. You have to weigh that. These are not easy solutions. This is the issue that has to be tackled by economists. And you remember, over the years, these were the issues that came up again and again and again. Just again to mention, for example, the first time where telecommunications was privatized. In other words, they allowed MCI, Sprint, and the others in the 90s, the early 80s, to come in. There was a suit by MCI and AT&T because all these private firms, Sprint and MCI, hatched on to the long distance lines and had access price. The question was the access pricing. And MCI said they are pricing us out. They give an advantage to AT&T itself in the long distance phone calls, and we are priced out by the price. AT&T said nothing of the sort. We have fixed costs. We have the switchboards and all these, the fixed cost of AT&T. We have to charge them for access, including the fixed cost, not only marginal cost. It came to the Supreme Court, and economists know the name, Ramsey pricing. Ramsey pricing is now on the Supreme Court records. So this came up in MCI. But you see, these are the issues that come up, difficult issues. Because once you privatize a national monopoly, a natural monopoly, then the issue of access pricing becomes paramount. What is the appropriate pricing? You allow providers of electricity from Saskatchewan to provide electricity to Los Angeles. What is the price that PG&E will charge them to hook on to the high wired, to the high voltage lines going from Canada to Los Angeles and so forth, and then this turned over to private distributors. Okay, that's the issue. Let's go fast to some. I said soft budget constraint. I want to show you just in a simple example why a soft budget constraint is created. It's simply it's a situation in which the managers, take a manager who has faces a decision to invest or not to invest. If he doesn't invest, he or she doesn't invest, then he gets zero, the government gets zero. If he or she invests, then there's a nature move, there's a probability of success, a probability of failure, okay? If there will be success, then the government will get some taxes from the outcome or revenue from that because of its ownership. The manager will get some benefit, personal benefit, and there are the profits. So the profits of the managers are P plus B, just notation. If it is a bad outcome, then the government has to face the following dilemma. If you bail out this enterprise, the manager still will get out his or her benefit B, but the government will have to subsidize that bailout, minus S. Chrysler. Okay? If you don't bail out, the manager loses also the B, but the government has a political cost. I denote this by X, just schematically. It's an X. You can see here that if X exceeds S, if the political cost exceeds the subsidies, the government has an interest of bailing out. And therefore, the manager will always decide to invest. There's no risk. This is the soft budget. Basically, in this game, the solution is always to bail out if things will go bad. If things will go well, fine. If things will go bad, the government will bail them out. So there's the moral hazard or the soft budget constraint. Sorry. Now, as I already said, that introducing competition, if possible, could be an alternative to privatization whenever the latter is not feasible. Okay? But, as I said, there are constraints to introducing competition, particularly political constraints. Not always is it possible, but in some cases competition is not possible, and in that case, as I'll point out to you, competition for the market will replace competition in the market. What I mean competition for the market is concessions, for example, and I'll come to it later on. When you have you want to build a private road, it's only one road, of course, there's one road. And so it's going to have some monopoly power over that stretch where the road goes, from the points where the road is located. But you can have an auction, the competition for building the road. If you have an honest and good auction, and auction theory is now a very well-developed branch of economics, then you have a competition for the market, and the government can extract for everybody, for the citizens, the full value of that, and the government has to set the tolls and so forth. I'll talk about that. So sometimes competition for the market replaces competition in the market. So what are the testable implications that I would like to come to? In fact, publicly owned enterprises in competitive environments do not perform better than privately owned companies, and you'll see the evidence on that. One should expect important efficiency gains from the changes in ownership structure in competitive sectors. Now I have to back these statements. And yeah, let me also say, sometimes we rush to say that profits. Let's see the profits, the profitability, and you'll see some of the books, for example, Megginson, World Bank studies, and so forth, looked at the profitability of state-owned enterprises before and and after they were privatized, and so the profits went up and concluded, well, the increase in profits is therefore a sign that these plants became more efficient. Well, not necessarily. It could be, because perhaps we should look more carefully into why did profits rise. They could rise because these now privately owned enterprises, the state-owned enterprise converted into private ownership, have exploited some monopoly or oligopoly power and raised prices to consumers. So the profits of these enterprises increased, but it was paid by consumers. Social welfare not necessarily increased because consumers paid the higher price. Another aspect is that sometimes laborers were let go. And in fact, a Latin American study, a very comprehensive study of Latin America, in particular Mexico, showed that the average layoff of workers after privatization in Latin American countries was 50%. By the way, at the same time, output doubled. An amazing increase in productivity. But the decrease in the layoffs of workers may create temporary unemployment. That's a social cost. So just now a word of a red light, a signal that profitability does not always comprehend all the social aspects of privatization. We have to look at other aspects, the cost unemployment, the macroeconomic implications, and the use of monopoly power that consumers, who pays for the increased profitability? Was it really an efficiency gain, or was it just a shift of the burden to consumers? Okay? Reducing the net transfers of SOEs in the aggregate, we talked about that. Okay. The macroeconomic implications, I think, are obvious, and I already said about the negative implication, the negative effect on employment, which has been in Latin America quite severe at the beginning, but a positive effect in the medium and long run. Now, and I said, here are the reasons. I said profitability of the firms increase at the expense of society through price increases, and profitability comes at the expense of workers involving large layoffs. Indeed, they were large. But I said these are temporary, transitory. So here is from a study on 218, I remember, Mexican firms done by Laporta and Flores de Lopez de Silanes. And they showed that these worries that the increase in profitability was not due to increased efficiency is not justified. They calculated, and in a minute I'll show you just the type of indices, how they calculated it. 10% of the increase in profits, which were typical in the Mexican privatization in the early 90s, is due to increase in prices. So yes, prices were increased, real prices. Prices of the privatized enterprises relative to the price level in the economy were increased by 10%, indeed. But only 10%, okay? So it explained 10% of the increase in profitability. 33% came from the laid-off workers, a significant part of the explanation for the increased profitability. But 57% was induced by productivity gains. And this should be remembered. So while indeed there were components that were due to the shift from public to private ownership, which are due to price increases and to layoffs, but the major part was increase in productivity of those enterprises. Just to give you an example, I don't want to go into equations here. How did they calculate the price contribution? They took sales minus cost, which is the profits, divided by sales. So it's profits per unit of sale, nominal. And then they took, again, profits in real terms, because they discounted the sales by the price level increase. Pi is the increase in real prices. So then this is discounted sales, and sales were discounted. So this is the difference. The difference between nominal and real increase in profits is the explanation of how much how much price increases contributed to the increased profitability. Okay? Similarly for labor layoffs. I won't go into the numbers, but you can see the kind of study that Lopez de Silanes and others did. All the indices, profitability, operating efficiency, sales, employees, and so forth, all these increased. The median change was, say, 15%. The mean change was 35% increase of profitability after privatization relative to what happened beforehand, under the state-owned ownership. Now, let's go further down here. I don't want to stay for too long. Also, they studied what was the difference between, in some industries, the government left them alone. In some industries, they had still kept regulation in place. And they showed that those industries that were privatized but were left under regulatory regime of one sort or another were less successful in privatization than those that were deregulated. So deregulation should complement privatization. Deregulation should complement privatization. Also, they had subsamples of competitive and non-competitive sectors, and they showed that the competitive sector was more successful than the non-competitive sector because of the discipline of the market, the pressures of competition. And so this was a very convincing study that broke down the successful privatization process in Mexico. Another study by the World Bank, 1994 study by Megginson and the others, looked again at similar data. I will not go much into it. You see again, they had 7 criteria: profitability, efficiency, investment, output, employment, and so forth. In all these cases, the mean change and the median change was positive. The increase was 2.42, 2.5% rate of return on profits, and so forth and so on. Also, here you see the competitive delta C larger than delta NC means simply the competitive sectors did better, fared better than the non-competitive industries, and so forth. I won't go down the list. What comes out from the picture from all these set of data, studies that were done in the late 90s and the early and the 2000 and afterwards, was privatization on the whole was successful. Now, okay, here are the conclusion. Capital expenditures, by the way, has in some studies had ambivalent results, because you would think that those enterprises that were privatized, the new owners, the private owners, would find the capital outmoded and they want to change the lines of production. So capital will be discarded, and therefore they will have to make new investment. On the other hand, state-owned enterprises had a very high capital intensity because capital was so cheap, the government gave guarantees to buy capital. And so there was excess capital when they owned it, and this had a trend towards decreasing capital expenditures at the beginning. Overall, capital expenditures had some ambivalent results after privatization. Now, I said infrastructure is the focus of what I want to talk about, and in particular, let me talk about the here's a process of privatizing natural monopolies or giving concessions out. You know what BOT are? BOT are build, operate, transfer. These are concessions is one way to outsource or to privatize infrastructure. So take Mexican roads or roads all in all in Latin America. Build, operate, transfer. You have a bidding for a road. They pay the private oops, I get some signals here. I'm here, dilemma. I wanted to talk about Russia. Anyway, let me, if you know what... Let's
do Russia after the break.
After the break, we'll do Russia, fine.
Yeah.
So build, operate, transfers. The problem with concessions are, for example, there are many problems with that. Take, for example, the Mexican failure of privatizing roads. It was a well-known failure. Why? Because the government provided guarantees for a certain traffic volume. Whenever the government provides guarantees to the concessionaires, this is trouble. The risk should be borne by the private owners, by the operators, the private operators. So in Mexico, it was a failure, and the government had to acquire back those private roads. A real bad experience. Then you can also see the incentives. Typically, road concessions, private road, toll roads in Mexico were given for 30 years. Towards the end of those 30 years, the incentive of the operators, namely the private firm, they give it back to the government. At the end, they give it back. It's build, operate, transfer. At the end of 30 years, they hand it back to the government. When they hand it back towards the end of the concession, the incentive of investing in maintenance and keeping the quality of those concessions is really decreasing significantly. Very difficult to monitor the quality of the investments towards the end of the concession. So there are all kind of other methods that have been developed. For example, those who had the operators for the first 30 years have a first shot at being also the continuation. Will get the concession afterwards. They'll get some advantages, so they'll have an incentive to maintain the quality of those roads and others. But anyway, I'm just saying the maintenance, the quality, preserving the quality of the roads during the concession was a problem. I think I will have to cut it short here, and I'll tell you about a really interesting experience of Russia and California electricity.
Take a break. Thank you very much for listening. That's perfect. That's perfect.
I planned for 3 o'clock, so I'm a little...
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. Oh, it was recent.
And here's a...
Okay. I don't know how I missed it. Somehow it got into my brain, but it didn't give me any...
Frank's dad.
How do you do?
The other day.
Yes, indeed, indeed. I remember.
Very good. I'm staying.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
staying.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
You just have the real go-getters here now. We appreciate that, though. I apologize. I should have given you a heads up on the 15-minute break, and then we'll continue. It is what it is.
No problem.
But it's good. I like it.
Stay there?
Fine.
The professor says stay where you are.
You're
fine.
Let's not waste time. I want to talk now less structured, no slides. Let's talk about two things. I wanted to tell you briefly about why some elements of the California electricity problems, which you may remember, because in privatizing infrastructure like electricity, God is in the details. And in some cases, some people have concluded from the California debacle on electricity in the early 90s. You remember when price of electricity jumped 800%, and they had to create an emergency law and so forth for all that, and the state actually took over some of these companies like Edison and others. Some people concluded that privatizing is just wrong, infrastructure. Let's stay the way we have been. But that's really the wrong conclusion to my mind, and I think most economists. You look at another model, which was on the East Coast, the PJM model, Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland model of privatizing electricity. It's going extremely well, efficiently, and going on for many years now. What were the issues that were wrong in electricity privatization in California? First of all, the first, of course, discovery, sort of idea of privatizing electricity is that privatization there, the product can be unbundled. Unbundling is actually the issue with privatizing electricity. In other words, the stage of production, electricity of production, production, transmission, and distribution. There are two or three stages basically. First, you have the vertically integrated electricity companies from production, transmission, high wire voltage transmission, and then distribution to the consumers, the retail. Okay, these were the old-fashioned, and until some years ago, for example, the only company in the world that was still vertically integrated in that fashion was EDF, Électricité de France. Now they have also privatized some aspects. The first way to go in privatizing was to allow for private producers of electricity, private producers, power stations, private generators established by private owners who would sell to the publicly owned company, PG&E or whatever, okay? State-owned enterprise. In the UK, this was done in most countries now, in most developing countries as well. These are easy contracts. The power production agreements are relatively easy. For example, how do they do it in the UK? It's basically a monopsony. The public enterprise, the public firm, asks for bids for the next day. For example, how is it done in the UK? Every day, they ask for every half hour of the day bids from all the private producers. Every half hour. And they submit bids at pricing, 8 to 8:30 a.m., and so forth and so on, for every half hour. And they chart out these prices in a stacking order, in an increasing order, basically a supply curve. And they cut it where they need it. Of course, they need, and I'll come to it also, a spot price, because sometimes you cannot predict, and electricity is not a commodity that is storable. Okay? But basically, they cut it off and tell those people who are under the price for those hours who will supply the electricity, and there's access to the electricity lines. Okay? That's a relatively easy issue. Both financially, the contracts are easy, and most countries have undergone that stage with private producers of electricity. The second stage is already much more difficult. because it allows for wholesale competition. Namely, as I said, the producer in Saskatchewan, I said, wants to transmit to a distributor in the Los Angeles area. He needs access to the lines, the high voltage lines, the transmission, which is still the public monopoly, okay, the public monopoly. So the focus now, from now on, is about access pricing. What should be the appropriate price to charge for this power station in Saskatchewan who made a contract with the distributor in the Los Angeles area to transmit the electricity. And that's an issue which has been, requires already, I said under the rubric of Ramsey pricing, should you charge fixed cost, only variable cost? Future contracts too, what is the charge now? Spot contracts, future contracts. This is already much more complicated financially, but many developed countries have already gone that way, but in the developing world, not yet. And finally, you have the competition at the retail market, where in a particular dwelling in Los Angeles, a high-rise, the people in the first, like in telecommunications, in the first floor, people will get it from supplier A, the electricity, the supplier, in the second floor, they get it from supplier B. The lines are, of course, the same. This is a company which need not own those lines. It need not own, but it just has a concession to own it. It rented, it leased those lines. It has access to those lines. So now the distributors do not need to be in the electricity business. They're in the financial business. They make packages. People who, for example, use electricity only on a steady rate will get a discount. Some people want to use it in certain seasons of the year, some people, and so forth and so on. They are specializing in packaging financial packages. That's the final stage of privatization. Now, what went wrong in California? Quite a number of things, but mainly, you cannot go in privatizing one part and leaving the other part regulated. What they did there, they privatized their wholesale, the private producer, and wholesale prices rose significantly. They did not allow consumer prices, again, political considerations, social, they did not allow consumer prices to rise accordingly. And therefore, Edison and other companies went bankrupt. They just couldn't stand it. This disparity between wholesale price and retail prices was not sustainable. And you know, some things you have to do in a bank, like somebody suggested that in the UK, where the cars go on the left-hand side rather than on the right-hand side. We all, by the way, our system, the US, the rest, most of the world, except the UK and some of the British colonies, past British colonies, are going in the other way. This is Napoleonic. This was Napoleon who wanted to diversify from what the UK did that. He just did the opposite. And so there was a suggestion that now the UK should move to the American system, okay? But somebody suggested, let's do it slowly, not once at a time. First only buses, and then private cars and so forth. Yeah, some things have to be done simultaneously all the way, right, in a bang-bang solution. And that's what happened in California. They didn't go all the way. In other words, they privatized one end of the electricity privatization, the wholesale prices rose, but they kept regulated prices at the consumer level, regulated and at low level, and this disparity could not be sustained. And that created basically the conflict. There was also a lot of other things, scheming by the companies to raise prices. They held back the electricity production. There's also another question. How many firms does it take to have competition? The whole idea is actually that you'll have competition. How many does it take? It's not only the number of firms, it's also their size, the market concentration. And that's a question which has not been settled yet. But I'm saying competition, in principle, is certainly a necessary condition for successful privatization in a market like electricity. Otherwise, and you'll see in some firms have really monopoly power, they get into agreements, and this was reported, still debated, how much of that was scheming by Edison, holding back production and contributing to this rise of 800% in California electricity prices in some time. I'll stop here in California and want to tell you about the Russian move to a completely different world. But I think it's a fascinating story. Now, you know, we're talking about the Soviet Union. Everything was owned by the government. And then in the early 90s, when the Soviet regime fell, and they were talking about privatizing the economy as a whole, the government established a certain authority called the GKI. It was headed by a person that is Anatoly Chubai, and he and others, Marcel Boyko and others, and Western economists like Andrei Schleifer, which I mentioned, others advised them from Harvard and others. I was at Harvard at the time and saw the scheming of that at that time, and they advised them on their privatization. The question was, the government decided first they had to corporatize. In the Soviet Union, the corporations were not corporatized. They were not legally entities by the law, legal entities. So first they were corporatized. That was by law, and that was done very successfully. Thousands, if I remember rightly, 5,000 enterprises between 90 and 91 were corporatized. In other words, legally registered as shareholding. The government still owned 100% of the shares. There were state-owned enterprise from now on. But accounting was according to Western standards of accounting, supposedly. Okay? That was the first step. Then they divided the economy into three sectors. The first sector composed of small businesses and dwellings and so forth, which were to be privatized for money, for cash. So you lived in your apartment, you could pay the rent from now on. The rent will go towards acquiring your apartment, part of your salary, and this was done easily and quickly, and people acquired the apartments in which they lived. Okay? That was the first. Small stores, a bakery, a small hotel in your neighborhood, and so forth, they were privatized for cash. There was an inducement. The province governments got that cash, the revenues from that, so they wanted to have this executed very efficiently and quickly, and it was done successfully. The second segment, which I want to expand on, was state-owned enterprises which need permission to be privatized, and that I want to explain. But that these are the medium and large-sized enterprises, but non-military and not the natural resources. And the third one, which was left for later, were the military, the defense, and the natural resources, which were not done in the first stage. So I want to focus on the second segment, namely medium and large enterprises which were to be privatized with permission, and many received that permission. The way the process went was the following. At that time in Russia, and you see here again the mix between politics and economics, the constituency for privatization was not that large. The Communist Party in the early 90s was still the largest party in Russia at that time. It didn't have, the prime minister was not communist, but they were the largest party in parliament. A coalition of other parties had held the majority. So the issue of enlisting the population behind privatization was also a goal of privatization. The way they went about it is the following. They wanted to enlist the workers to support the privatization. So in each enterprise, there were three alternatives posed for vote to the workers. One was that the workers and the management will receive about 20% of the shares free, but non-voting shares. And the rest will be sold in other ways. I won't go into because that alternative anyway didn't get many votes. The second alternative, the one that got 78% of the vote, was that the workers and the management will get 51 or 52% of the shares voting for about 1.7 times the book value of the enterprise. Book value under the Soviet Union was minimal, and the workers could pay that out of their future salaries. There was no money they couldn't get, so from future salary, very generous. 78% of the workers voted for that. And you'll see this is part of the reason why it really didn't work very well. And there was a third proposal also that was put forward by management in Russia, that the management will receive 40% of the shares in return for a guarantee that the enterprise will not go bankrupt or will not be closed for a number of years. Anyway, all these, the 1 and 3 were not voted for. Number 2 was the overall one that adopted in all enterprises. So at the end of the day, in the first stage, the workers and the management had about 10% on paper. People who did surveys later on found that the management had much more. in various ways, legal and illegal. They acquired shares from the workers. The management had much more than 10%. But the original plan was management 10% and the workers the rest, and they had 51% of the shares. And then the plan was that the rest of the shares will be sold in what they called voucher auctions. The reason was Russia didn't have any financial institutions. So how can private financial institutions bid for the shares? How will be the purchase? How do you privatize in an economy which doesn't have financial institutions? So the solution they found, which also satisfied the political constraint, political objectives, was they sent every Russian received in his or her savings bank a voucher. On the voucher was written 100,000 rubles. It didn't mean anything. But a piece of paper, the number 100,000 was supposed to give it sort of look good. Many zeros, look good. What will you do with it? Can you buy a tomato? What do you do with this piece of paper? But then everyone, and 93% of the Russians picked that up in no time, because it was basically free. I think 5 cents per voucher. In the Czech Republic, later on, when they did voucher privatization, they charged $35. The idea was only those really interested will do it. In Russia, as I said, the goal was as much to enlist, everybody should have it, should have an ownership. Everybody should have a part in the privatization plan. Okay? So they picked up the vouchers, and then they had what they called voucher auctions. Voucher auctions meant the following. Again, this was a primitive way of auctions. There are many ways of auction, Dutch auction, other types of auctions. The Russians had, this is the most simple, but these were the constraints. Voucher auctions were the following. Suppose ZIL was the largest motor car and limousine producer in Russia. 100,000 workers and the largest in value. And take ZIL, for example. ZIL wanted to privatize. They had a certain amount of shares of ZIL enterprises on the market, and this was announced. People could send in their vouchers by mail, and then they simply divided the number of shares by the vouchers, and it was clear how many shares each voucher receives. Nobody went home empty. But it was an idea you had to send in the voucher before you knew what will be the price, how much you'll get for that. But that was the method. So people sent in the vouchers for ZIL, for example, which was in a certain town. It was in the headquarters, just about 100 kilometers south of Moscow. They sent in their vouchers. The next week or so, there was announced how many shares each voucher will get, and you will send those shares home. Okay? A very primitive method. Again, people betting their vouchers, not knowing. But another aspect which is interesting is, and a good one, vouchers could be traded in the market. And that was a good aspect because people who wanted to acquire ownership and control over companies wanted to buy additional vouchers. So there were voucher companies, and about $1 million a day traded in the Moscow market every day of vouchers. The price of if you look at there's a graph of voucher price, $10, $20, going on the path of political upheavals in Moscow. When Yeltsin was sick, the voucher price went down and up, but then around $10, $20 per voucher, that was the value, and you could trade. And voucher firms, then bid many vouchers to get control over enterprises. What was so as I said, the defining feature of Russian privatization was the voucher privatization. The amazing feature I find in Russian privatization was the low value that these enterprises received in the voucher auctions. So for example, ZIL enterprises, 100,000 workers, de facto monopoly over the Russian market at that time. There's not much import of other cars or limousines and so forth, and trucks. And the value of that company from the voucher auction, you can calculate how many vouchers and what the vouchers traded in the market. So you could see what is the value, just calculate it, easy calculation. The value of ZIL by these voucher auctions was about $15 million. Each one of you could buy that, right? Similarly, tractor, the largest tractor, Uralmesh and Permsky and there were many other enterprises. The GE and the GM of Russian industry were sold for pittance. And then the question, why do I say, by the way, they were too cheap? You would expect them to be cheaper than American shares, but in what is my measure? I'm saying Russian wages at that time were about $200 a month. Western wages, on average, were $2,000. In the West, a rule of thumb, of course, varies from industry to industry. The value per worker of a firm is $100,000 per worker. Okay? Roughly, the average in the industry. In Russia, it was 1/10 of that. In that sense, I'm saying it's cheap. Indeed, the products were outmoded, but they had a monopoly power de facto and so on, but they were sold cheap. Why? And I think a number of explanations, but the focal explanation to my mind is this voucher, the votes on the alternatives at the beginning, the stakeholders. Once the workers and the management had 51%, the new owners, those who wanted to buy these shares, knew that there will be a very hard time to extract the profits when the workers had 51%. And indeed, that was the case. The workers, you see, the old Soviet style was the workers had the kindergarten, the school, the pension. Everybody was in the firm. And they knew the workers would never let go. And there were all kind of court cases. Also, I won't go into the legal aspect. The Russians had to build a whole new legal structure. They didn't have corporate law. See, other countries, smaller countries like Poland, adopted the pre-Second World War law. So Poland, for example, adopted their law. Other countries adopted laws from other countries. From the Netherlands, for example, I forget whether it's Hungary or other, they adopted corporate law from the Netherlands, just stock and barrel, and so forth. But the Soviet Union, which was under communism for 80 years, had also to erect a legal system. And there were no clear bankruptcy laws, which also detracted from future investors. If you don't go in if you don't know the exit. If you don't have clear exit laws, you're worried. And this was the case. So the explanation is mainly that once this vote, that the workers got a majority of the ownership at the beginning, and then they sold a minority holding to other foreign investors, these foreign investors knew that it's going to be very, very difficult. The hope of the planners was, of course, that let's call it greed, will take over. The workers will sell. The new owners will have a bid for the shares that the workers owned. This was very slow, if at all. Took many years. The second round, in other words, after voucher privatization, took many years. And it just happened much, much later. Now it is happening still very slowly. So all in all, I would say the Russian privatization was not a great success, but those who planned it, you read in Schleifer and others, Boyko, Chubai, all these people who were around the planning, they said it was a success given the constraints. We had to get all the people on board in favor of privatization, which is not the case in the West. It was never a political, serious, the trade unions didn't like that. That's, by the way, it's another question with the trade unions. Again, what I called before a schizophrenic issue. Take a trade union. Sorry, I'm jumping here, but trade unions who know that some of the workers will be laid off, but the rest of the workers, as in Mexico in particular, the real wages will rise significantly. Whom should they represent? Those that remain or those who are laid off? I don't know the answer, but typically the trade unions were against privatization. So this is the answer, de facto. But I'm saying it's in principle, why shouldn't the trade unions say the government should give some, of course, generous safety nets to those who are laid off, like every country has, and we will, since we know that the workers who will stay on will really benefit after privatization, and the data in Mexico, which I didn't go deeply into, well, indeed shows these positive developments afterwards. Real wages rose significantly in the privatized sector. The trade unions were against. So I'm saying the defining feature of Russian privatization, the voucher privatization, was basically a failure. The other, just to finish here, and then we'll open up for questions, the other transition economies like Poland, Hungary, and others didn't go for that. They went for a different model. For example, in Poland, just as an example, they gave their shares of the state-owned enterprises. You see, in the first stage of moving from the Soviet-style economy to a privatized economy, all the shares are owned by the government. They gave it to 14 mutual funds, owned by the government still, in the first stage. And then each one of these mutual funds got the advice of a US or other Western investment banking to advise them how to sell, how to privatize, how to restructure, and so forth. Whether it was Morgan Stanley or Shearson or Lehman and so forth, all these. They all had a hand in these mutual funds, which eventually sold, and then they sold the mutual funds themselves to private ownership. So they went in a more soft, in a softer way in privatizing Poland, and successfully. And the last sentence, Poland, you know, when we predicted ahead of time what country will be ahead of the pack after the fall of the Soviet system, everybody said, of course, Germany, which was indeed the East Germany, and then they said the Czech Republic, and then Hungary, and then Poland. Surprise was Poland did much better than these two others, and because of the structure. So again, God is in the structure and the details. So I think the Soviet, the voucher privatization, which sometimes comes up also in other countries, in Western countries, they say, let's give the population vouchers, came up in a number of Western countries. Why not send the population vouchers, and the vouchers will entitle them to shares of the state-owned enterprises. That's why it will be the distributional aspect, the income distribution aspect will be egalitarian. Perhaps. Of course, the government getting the revenue is doing its consideration of egalitarian and distributional considerations. It's only indirectly. And so I think in general, voucher privatization in well-developed financial markets is not an advisable method. The Russian experience is separate indeed, but I think the way it went in the West, in other words, privatization by just financial markets, auctions, and so forth, is a preferred method. Thanks very much.
To ask the first question.
Sure.
And so the question I've got is, how open were these markets to ownership from foreigners? You touched on this lightly, but were foreigners allowed to purchase the vouchers, for example? Were they allowed to trade the vouchers, or were they forced to stay in a minority position? And how were there rules and regulations about their holding period, that sort of thing? Well, how would the institution work in that regard? And if you could also touch on other Eastern European examples, other than that, you mentioned Poland, but right. Hungary, Bulgaria, or some of the others. Could you right. mention some of those?
Okay. In Russia, as far as I know, on the second tier, those industries that were not strategic industries, defense or natural resources, I haven't said much about those. In a minute, we'll come to those. I don't recall that there was a restriction on foreign ownership, but the foreigners, as I told you about the voucher privatization, were really hesitant to come in. There was hardly anything. Whenever a Western firm entered into those markets and acquired some ownership, like Johnson & Johnson, I remember acquired a large pharmaceutical in Poland, and GM bought the largest bus company in Hungary, and so forth. That was allowed. That was okay. So I don't remember that there was an official constraint on foreign ownerships, but they didn't have the majority anyway. They didn't have the control. When it comes to the third, to those firms that were not allowed to be privatized in the first stage, strategic industries, which are not privatized yet. Some of them, the defense industry, for example, has not been privatized, and I think that it's understandable in many countries, although some other countries at least parcel out some inputs into the defense industry, but in the Soviet Union, in Russia today, that has not been done yet. It's a very vertically integrated, the defense industry is vertically integrated, but the natural resources have been eventually been privatized. That's where, just in a word here, this is a whole new issue, the kind of the corruption and the regulation. How come, some of you have read, needless to say, you have read about the oligarchs, so-called the oligarchs. How come you found out 10 years after privatization in Russia that you have 11 or 13 people who have each one of them more than $20 billion worth of assets. Where did that money come from? It's hard to believe that this was all done in a completely legal way. I remember also visiting Moscow in the early days of privatization, and I saw the Mercedes cars going through, and I thought, how can these people afford these cars in such a short time after privatization when people had nothing just a couple of years earlier? And indeed, so let's take just an example, just one example to show you how this is tied to regulation and to banking and to the sequencing of privatization, which I couldn't really do justice to in this lecture. Take the guy who is now in jail, Michael Khodorkovsky, who bought the largest oil producing firm at that time called Yukos. It is now has been acquired by Gazprom, which really under Putin now is an absorbing barrier, absorbs all the others. It's again, it goes back to the state now. There's a reverse process. Khodorkovsky, the way he did it, first they acquired a bank or a series of a few small banks. And then, as an owner, or a group of owners, which he was one, the controlling interest in those banks, he received loans from those banks. Typically, banks are not allowed to provide loans to owners beyond a certain small percentage of the bank's assets, of the equity. In Russia, the regulation of banks was absolutely absent. So these banks lent to the new owners the money that was needed to buy Yukos. And the real culprit is the central bank, who did not erect regulation, the right regulation on the new private banks that were acquired by people like Khodorkovsky and the other guys, all of them, the names you may have heard afterwards. That was, say, one route in which these people basically did it when there was no regulation. So again, you see in a country like Russia, and in general, when you talk about major financial institutions, certainly in infrastructure, regulation and privatization have to go hand in hand. And the issue of what should go first is I think, for example, it's clear now that regulation in infrastructure and in the financial sector should precede privatization. You should erect first a credible regulatory authority that will oversee what is happening in those sectors. And then you can you can change ownership. And that was not done. In Russia, the regulatory process was just absent. In most, for example, Chile, which is a good example of a country which did have a very credible and successful regulatory process, they had a very good regulatory process, and therefore their privatization, for example, of Social Security, the issue I talked about the other day, has been so successful. They all looked, they didn't allow assets to be too risky and so forth, a very tight and credible regulatory process, distanced from any political influence. This was not the case in Russia.
I'm from Russia, actually, and I wanted to ask you, the results of privatization was so unfair.
A little louder.
The results of privatization in Russia was so unfair, and still electricity, water, and gas, everything, government owns it, even in Gazprom, which claims it's a private company, it's still under our government. But do you think in recent years the result of privatization will ever change, or will still be like this? Several cases or something.
It's a difficult question. You come from Russia and you ask me what happens. I think unfortunately, if I'm reading what happens in Russia, I feel the trend has reversed. The way Putin's Russia has just reversed some of these processes. In other words, the bureaucracy has taken over again a large part. That's why, for example, he didn't tolerate Khodorkovsky's influence, political influence. He wanted to acquire some media, TV stations and so forth. He was put in jail. You see, the problem is, in Russia, it's so easy to find flaw. Everyone who has money has some, you can find on him something to blame. that gives a lot of power to the authorities.
It goes back to Marx's comment that every rich man is either a thief or the senator.
Right. Exactly. So I'm saying, unfortunately, the way I read what happens in Russia is a reversal of what happened in the past. Now, and Gazprom is using its power all around. They've acquired, they've now dissected Yukos, and Gazprom acquired a large part of Yukos and others. And Gazprom, as you know, has a tremendous power over Europe. Here again, you see the value of competition. Some winters ago, Gazprom had a dispute. You know, there's an oil pipe from Russia going to Germany, for example. They had a dispute in Ukraine about the royalties that they have to give for the pipe, for the oil that flows through Ukraine. And the Gazprom, as a threat, just squeezed the valve and decreased the supply of oil and gas to Germany. And the Germans told them, if you do it once more, we will build an alternative pipeline, which is being built from the Persian Gulf, from the Gulf states, Turkey and other cases, to Germany. We do not want to depend on a company which is not run by business alone and has political incentives. And it helped. They immediately opened it up and they said we'll reconsider and so forth. So in Russia today, I would say, all in all, I see, unfortunately, a reversal of the processes.
How has privatization changed in light of the recent economic crisis? Has it reversed more towards state ownership, or has it continued?
Again, please. What is the question again? I'm sorry.
How, in light of the recent economic crisis, has the trend towards privatization continued? Has it increased, decreased? In light of the recent economic crisis since about 2007?
Globally.
Look, first of all, the bulk of the state-owned enterprise has been privatized by now. So what remains is really minor. In the developing world, you have quite a bit. You have still in India. China is a different story altogether, by the way. By the way, in China, I'll just say China is an interesting case, because in China, the state-owned enterprises are basically two sectors. There are those that are owned by Beijing, the central government, and these are the very large steel and all the large enterprises. And then you have the town and country enterprises that are owned by the villages and small cities in there. They are much more efficient than the Beijing-operated state-owned enterprises. And they have been growing much faster because the city or the village is living on the revenues that they get from that enterprise. So anyway, there are many studies that show that the state-owned enterprises that are the town and country enterprises are much more successful than the others. Now, to your question about what happened in the financial crisis, see, most of the banking sector was already privatized. Now, there was no back nationalization in any Western countries that I know of. The government has taken over in some cases. For example, in the UK, Royal Bank of Scotland has been taken over by the government. Okay, temporarily. I'm sure it will be re-privatized eventually. And the government already, the signs are, has made a good deal on that. As in this country, in some cases where the government pitched in, right? In insurance and so forth, AG, and others. But I don't think that the financial crisis has turned to nationalization or reversal of privatization, but it has done another aspect, which, if I may, in the sense that you remember the issue there was, should the government bailout intervene in these markets? Too large to fail was the slogan. And if you look now at the outcome, at the aftermath, when the dust settles of the financial crisis, you see that the concentration ratios have actually increased. So many banks have been acquired, by Wells Fargo, and others have all been acquired by other banks. If you look now at the concentration ratio in the banking industry in this country, for example, it's higher than it used to be before, than it was before, and I think it's similar in other countries as well. So I shift the emphasis of what you said to the issue of what is now the meaning of too big to fail.
Thank you so much. We have a little something for you. This is a little, I wish I could say it was a gold brick, but it's not a gold brick. It's a little glass case, but it has the name Jon M. Huntsman School of Business on it. We hope you'll have it on your desk.
Thank you so much.
And when you see it, you always remember
pleasure indeed.
the joy that we've taken in your visit.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean.